In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers died on one of Russia's most remote mountains. When rescuers reached the camp weeks later, they found something no one expected. The tent was destroyed. It had been cut open from the inside. The footprints in the snow showed that the hikers had escaped from the campsite in the middle of the night, barefoot, without adequate clothing, in temperatures that could kill a person in a matter of minutes. But what they found next was the most unsettling. The bodies were scattered throughout the forest. Some froze to death. Others had internal fractures so severe they appeared to have been caused by a violent impact. One of the victims was missing his tongue, and several articles of clothing showed traces of radiation. Soviet authorities investigated the case for months, but the file was closed with a strange explanation. The death was caused by an unknown natural force. More than 60 years later, the mystery remains unsolved. What really happened that night on the mountain? To understand, we must first learn about the people who started this expedition. The expedition began in late January 1959. The 9 hikers set off from the city of Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union, carrying everything they needed to survive for weeks in one of the harshest environments on the planet. Their journey began by train. For hours, the train traveled north through endless stretches of snow-covered forest. In the photographs taken during that journey, the group can be seen laughing, chatting, and gazing at the scenery through the windows. It seemed like the beginning of an exciting adventure. And for them, that's exactly what it was. After the train journey, the group continued their trek in trucks and makeshift vehicles that took them as close as possible to the mountainous region. From that point on, the rest of the journey would have to be completed on foot and skis. The hikers began their trek through dense forests and up slopes covered in deep snow. The temperatures were extremely low, but they were prepared. Each one wore specialized clothing, thick boots, heavy backpacks, and equipment for winter camping. For the first few days of the expedition, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The hikers advanced slowly, forging a path through the snow as the icy wind whipped at their faces. At night, they would set up their tent, light a small stove, and write in their journals. The journals, later found by researchers, reveal a relaxed and cheerful atmosphere. The hikers joked around. They sang songs. They took fun photographs. In one of those photographs, several of them can be seen smiling as a snowstorm begins to form behind them. No one seemed worried. No one imagined that those images would become some of the last documented moments of their lives. However, as they traveled north, the weather began to worsen. The snowstorms became more frequent. The wind grew stronger, and the temperatures began to drop to dangerous levels. Even so, the group pressed on. They were used to facing harsh conditions, and their goal was getting closer. But on February 1st, 1959, something changed. That day, they made a decision that would later be considered one of the keys to the mystery. They decided to camp on the mountainside, an exposed spot, without any natural protection from the wind. Instead of descending into the nearby forest, where they would have found shelter among the trees. Why did they make that decision? Some researchers believe it was simply a miscalculation. Others believe Dyatlov wanted to practice camping in extreme conditions to improve the group's skills. But whatever the reason, that decision put them in a vulnerable position. That night, in the middle of a snowstorm, something happened. something that forced them to abandon their tent in complete darkness. No one knows exactly what happened inside the store that night. There are no witnesses, there are no recordings, only the clues left behind. But those clues tell a disturbing story. Sometime during the night, something caused the hikers to panic. The clearest evidence is the way they left the tent. Instead of leaving through the normal entrance, they cut the fabric from the inside. The cuts were long and quick, made with knives, as if the group was trying to get out as fast as possible. After escaping the store, the hikers began walking downhill into the woods. The footprints found by rescuers indicated something strange. They weren't running. The marks in the snow suggested they were walking, but they were doing so without proper clothing. Some were barefoot. Others were only wearing socks. In temperatures near minus 30 degrees Celsius, this raises a disturbing question. What could compel experienced hikers to abandon their shelter in the midst of a deadly storm? One possibility is that they believed the tent was in immediate danger. Perhaps they thought an avalanche was about to strike. Perhaps they heard a terrifying sound coming from the mountain. Or perhaps they saw something that filled them with fear. Whatever the reason, the group decided to leave the camp. And they did so by walking into the woods, almost a kilometer away, in complete darkness, with the wind howling through the mountains, and with the snow slowly covering their footprints. When the group didn't return on the expected date, their families began to worry. The hikers were supposed to send a telegram confirming their return, but the message never arrived. At first, no one thought anything terrible had happened. On long expeditions, delays were common. However, when several days passed without any news, the authorities organized a search operation. Rescue teams made up of students, volunteers, and soldiers began exploring the region. For days, they traversed snow-covered mountains. The weather was brutal. The wind was so strong that sometimes it was impossible to move forward. Finally, after weeks of searching, one of the teams found something. The tent. It was partially covered in snow, but it was still standing. When the rescuers approached, they immediately noticed something strange. The tent was open, not at the entrance, but with several cuts made from the inside. Inside, they found backpacks, boots, coats, supplies. Everything was there. Everything had been left behind, as if the hikers had suddenly abandoned the campsite. The footprints in the snow began right outside the tent. The rescuers followed them, and those footprints led them into the woods. What they found there was even more disturbing. The first bodies were found near the edge of the forest. Two hikers lay near a large tree. They had tried to light a fire. The nearby branches were broken, as if they had tried to tear them off to feed the flames. But the fire had been small, insufficient to protect them from the extreme cold. The investigators also noticed something strange. One of the men's hands was badly injured. The injuries suggested he had tried to climb the tree, as if he were trying to observe something or escape from something. A few meters from the tree, rescuers found another body. It was Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader. His body was facing the tent, as if he had tried to return to camp. Later, they found two more bodies. They all seemed to have tried to return, but none of them made it. Months later, when the snow began to melt, rescuers discovered the last four bodies. They were in a deep ravine, and their injuries would completely change how the mystery was interpreted. The last four hikers had much more serious injuries. One had a fractured skull. Another had multiple broken ribs. The autopsies revealed something that baffled investigators. The fractures were extremely severe, comparable to those that could be caused by a car accident. But there was a problem. There were no significant external injuries. There were no deep cuts. There were no signs of direct blows. It was as if an enormous force had crushed their bodies without damaging the skin. And that wasn't the only strange detail. One of the hikers was missing her tongue. Some articles of clothing showed traces of radiation. And several witnesses claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky the same night the tragedy occurred. Soviet authorities ultimately closed the case with an ambiguous explanation. The deaths were caused by an unknown natural force. More than 60 years later, the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved. The mountain stands there, covered in snow, silent, and perhaps guarding a secret that will never be revealed. But as the wind continues to blow across the so-called Mountain of the Dead, one question continues to haunt researchers and curious onlookers alike. What could have really happened that night to force 9 experienced hikers to abandon their shelter in the midst of a deadly storm?